And we are live for a solid 10 seconds now. Anyhow, today is going to be a somewhat different livecast compared to what I normally do. Normally I open it up to everyone and we'll have a ton of comments and a long Q&A that extends into sometimes really obscene parts of the night. Today I want to do something a little bit different. We bought a house and I spent the whole week moving, which is an interesting exercise that is not for the faint of heart. And on top of it, I managed to get sick, so I'm a little bit under the weather. So what I did is that I limited the comments to channel members, and this is my sort of shameless attempt to keep the Q&A short this time, so that I can go to sleep. I'm really not feeling great, hence no alcohol. Same glass, but this is not vodka, this is water. What I want to talk about today is scope mounts. All of my stuff is in various boxes. So rather than show you a lot of stuff, I figured I'm going to first go through the few things that I find to be useful general guidelines as far as scope mounts go. And depending on what kind of questions and comments I get later, I can do another video where I'm going to go through the whole exercise of what to look for in a scope, mounting a scope and all that. I do have a few scopes and mounts here, as you may imagine. There is always something. But today what I want to do is mostly do sort of general guidelines. I have some notes, so forgive me if I keep looking at them. And I will... I'll get moving. So first of all, mount types. There used to be a lot more diversity in different mounts. Nowadays, there has been a pretty strong convergence on Picatinny Stanag type mounts, and most of what I use is those. There are different mount types, double dovetail and all sorts of other stuff. Unless you're going for a particular look or some historic thing in a modern market, there is really very little reason to go with one of those. Now, if I were to choose what I believe to be the best mounting system, what I believe to be the best is actually what's European, the Zeiss rail, this machine dovetail on the bottom of the scope tube, where you do not have rings clamping over the scope tube. And I'm going to pull up an image and I'll share my screen so that you could see what I mean. Where is it? And I have one here. You will see it in a moment. I apologize, but not always have everything ready. This is perfect. This is a picture of me with an AR with a Blaser 1:7 by 28 scope. There we go. So notice that what I have here, there is a Picatinny riser. And then there are these mounts that clamp onto a part of the scope tube that's machined on the bottom of the scope. This is the lowest stress on a scope that I can think of. Okay, it works exceedingly well, but for whatever reason, maybe because it's European, it has not really been successful in the US, and it is very unfortunate. This is ultimately a better way to mount a scope. If there is some sort of misalignment or something like that, there's very little stress on the internal optical components, and stress on internal optical components is something that we will talk about quite a lot today. Okay, so if you have a rifle that allows this kind of a mount, and the scope you're interested in comes with this kind of a mount, I strongly recommend it. I think this is an excellent way to go. All right. Okay, with that out of the way, most of my rifles have some sort of a Picatinny Stanag mount. For ARs, this is a single piece type stuff like this odd mount. They use quite a lot. For oftentimes there'll be separate rings, two separate rings. These are Kelblies rings. And I have a bunch of others from Burris and Sikkens and TPS and you name it. There's a lot of advantages in uniformity, and these kind of a Stanag Picatinny type rail mounts are very ubiquitous. They're very easy to find. They come in a variety of sizes. If I'm building a new rifle and I want to be able to move scope mounts to mount, etc., I'm probably going to go with this interface. Okay. A good example of, so here's this Delta Striker that I keep on showing in all my videos in a Geissele mount that fits a standard interface. An example of and something archaic. So this is our old Mosin Nagant PU scope, and this has this weird split ring, so the scope slides in, right? So their number of different mounts out there is quite staggering, and unless you have historical interest, you should pretty much ignore most of them. Don't try to reinvent the wheel when you don't have to. Okay. All right. I mentioned Stanag and 1913 rail. They look similar. They started as Weaver, then there was Picatinny, and then there was a Stanag standard rail. It was called Rail Grabber interface. They look similar. They're not exactly the same. And given a choice, go with the Stanag interface. Here is the reason. So first of all, what is the difference? I have a picture here. Let me cast that on the screen. And see, there we go. All right, you should see to... Interesting. Everything frozen. I don't know if you can still hear me. My browser is doing something bizarre. If it crashes, I'll just restart it. And we will give it another shot. Of course. Now that sucks. Okay, I hope you can see me again. My browser crashed, so I had to restart. I don't know what's up with that. The image I was trying to show you on the difference between, let's see if it crashes again. Here we are. Okay. So Weaver and Picatinny are very similar. The cross slots in the Weaver is a little bit narrower, and nowadays you see very few Weaver type bases. Picatinny, which is Mill Standard 1913, and NATO Stanag rail grab interface look nearly identical, but they differ in terms of how they are specified, right? And this picture is exactly what you see. What you see in blue and red lines are the datum surfaces, how the mount grabs the rail. For example, the Geissele that I have, this is a Mill Standard 1913 mount. And the way it grabs the rail, it uses these 4 datum surfaces, these kind of a diagonal short surfaces, and it kind of squeezes the rail from the sides. This works just fine. There's nothing really wrong with it if everything is in spec, the mount, the rail, everything. I've seen a ton of out of spec rails, and when the rail is a little bit out of spec, what you get is that as the mount starts squeezing, it starts tilting one side or the other, and on an undersized rail or oversized rail, also what happens is that you don't have consistent engagement, so it doesn't return to 0 very well, and it mounts in an inconsistent manner. It's just not a great thing. The NATO standard does a similar thing, except it defines the contact surfaces in a different way. It basically, the clamp contacts the rail on these 2 bottom diagonal surfaces, right? And pulls the mount down so that it makes contact with the large top flat surface of the rail. For example, the odd mount is designed in that way. And one of the things you see, if you look at the cross section, I'm going to put up another image where I took a picture of what it looks like from the back. There we go. So let me pull up another image for you, and you'll understand what I mean. Okay. So this, yeah, there we go. You should be able to see it now. So this is an odd mount clamped over an AR-15 top upper receiver. And you notice that on the 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock portions of the rail, it's not touching anything, right? So it's kind of grabbing it below at the 7 o'clock and the 5 o'clock, and pulls the mount down onto the rail. And that creates for an extremely consistent mounting method. Most importantly, it's pretty forgiving of out of spec parts, of whether we're talking about the mount or the rail. Okay, so this portion is sort of important. Why else is it important? Another reason why it is important is torque. If you are just squeezing this rail from the sides, you really have to be super careful with torque. If you are using a NATO spec mount, when it's basically being pulled on top of the large flat portion of the rail, it's much more forgiving of torque settings, right? If you are looking for the most repeatability, you still need a torque wrench and all that. However, if you just want to mount it reliably, you don't need to worry about all that much. Now, don't go farmer tight on it, but you have a lot of leeway, and it will still work perfectly fine, right? Okay, that's Picatinny versus Stanag. Let's move on. So, well, you know what? Since I mentioned torque, let's talk a little bit about torque wrenches. My original plan was to show you my torque wrench, but there is nothing really that exotic about it. I have three sets of different torque wrenches, and I most of the time only use one. I have a kit from Borka Tools that I used for many years. About a year or so ago, I bought a kit from FixIt Sticks. And in terms of usability, I like it quite a bit more, but both work just fine. Shameless disclaimer, FixIt Sticks just started doing some sort of an affiliate program with Avant link, so I signed up. And after this is all done, I'll put some links to the exact FixIt Sticks kit that I use. But it's called the all-in-one kit, and I think they've got some sort of a discount right now going for Black Friday, so it's not a bad time to pick one up. But honestly, any decent torque wrench will work totally fine for you. Okay. I also have this German one called Felo, I think, Felo. It also works fine, except there I have to transfer the scale is in Newton meters, so I have to transfer it in foot pounds. But that's pretty much it. In a subsequent video, I'll talk a little bit more about torque wrenches when I find them in whatever box they happen to be right around now. One other thing that becomes important that I don't see covered too much. All right, so you've got your tools, you've got your torque wrench or a little L wrench. Honestly, for a lot of stuff, if I don't need repeatability, I take the little L wrench and just use that. And it works fine, but I have a lot of experience with this. If you're not sure, torque wrench is a good way to go. How much torque do you really need on the rigs? And also another question to consider, is it critical to torque things in a particular order? If you have a single piece mount, torque it to the rail, then pop the, so there is on a single piece mount, like on ARs or some lower ones for bolt actions. You have a clamp, torque it to the rail. Here you can have a fair bit more torque. Go with what the mount manufacturer suggests. They will all have something to say. Plop the scope in and torque these things evenly so that the gap on the two sides of the rings are even. So what I usually do, I take a little L wrench and I kind of, while I'm lining things up, I cinch it down lightly, and then I finish it off with a torque wrench, kind of going the usual crisscross pattern that we're all used to seeing. There are plenty of scope mounting videos on YouTube. If you guys want me to go through it step by step, I'll be happy to. Once I dig everything out, and I'll do a part 2 of the scope mount video. Okay. Where things get entertaining is that when you have, let's say, you have a scope and you have a mount. The scope manufacturer and the mount manufacturer both provide some sort of a torque rating, and they're different. What do you go with? Okay. What you go with is the torque rating numbers that were provided by the scope manufacturer. There is a little bit of a case of sort of a mixed loyalties in a way. First of all, scope manufacturer has no idea, mount manufacturer has no idea what kind of scope is being used, and different scopes have different sensitivity to various. Give me one sec. Right. Halfway through the video, I realized that I forgot to turn my light on. I'll blame it on the move and the cold and all that. Where was I? Yeah. Now that you can see a reflection from my bolt spot, I feel more confident. Now, a scope manufacturer has no idea what mount manufacturer has no idea what scope is going to be in it, and they all react to torque and to being clamped differently. So go with what the scope manufacturer tells you. However, all of the different rankings, torque recommendations that the scope manufacturer gives you, at least all the ones that I have seen, are intended for scope rings that have 4 screws, right? So once again, looking at the odd mount, there is a front and rear ring, 4 screws in the rear ring, 6 screws in the front ring. I actually know a ton of people, some people who work for scope companies, who, when they have a 6-screw ring, they don't use the center screws, they just use 4, because it's generally enough. They're right, it's generally enough, but I use 6. But what I often do, although it kind of depends on which scope and which mount, what I often do, I back off on the torque a little bit. I generally tend to go a little bit easy on the torque, although that depends on the mount. With mounts that have plastic inserts, composite inserts, like some of the odd mounts, like Burris XTR signature rings, I kind of go easy on a torque. Generally, if, let's say, scope manufacturer says 18 inch-pounds, they mean 18 inch-pounds if there are 4 rings. If there are 6 rings, I will take it down to about 15 or thereabouts and start from there. If I start seeing problems, I can adjust within reason, but honestly, I err on the side of a little bit less torque, unless you happen to have a scope that's a real kicker, right? If it's a real kicker, there are ways to work around it. You can use rosin. If it slips, you can use multiple rings. There are different mounts, right? If the scope really kicks, a wider ring will give you, will hold better, right? But ultimately, I've seen very, very few cases where something slipped, and usually that's when something is out of spec. Okay. All right, where were we there? Torque specifications. Yeah, so just go with what the scope manufacturer recommends, and if that gives you problems, if something slips, you can adjust from there. But usually, it's pretty safe to go with the scope recommendations. If you have a mount with split rings, people tend to tighten the clamp first really hard and then put the scope in the ring. That works well with single piece mounts. With individual rings, not so great. If your rail is very slightly out of spec and you've really tightened the bottom, you will scrape your scope going in. So with the separate mounts, I will make the clamp on the rail just snug. I'll set up the scope, make sure the reticle is level and all that sort of jazz. And I will tighten the clamp around the rail last. And if that starts giving me problems, then I know the rail is out of spec and I haven't damaged anything. If the rail is out of spec, you really fix the rings to it. When you push the scope down, you can scrape, damage something, do silly things that will only get worse when you clamp the scope ring halves. After that. Okay. All right. Moving right along, what's next on my list? Let's see. QD versus non-QD. So this is a question I get quite a lot. Should I get a QD mount or should I not get a QD mount? QD stands for quick detachable. I've tried a lot of QD mounts. Generally, you only need a QD mount, quick detachable mount, if you plan to be detaching the scope a lot and may need to do it in a hurry where you don't have time to get your tools. Of all of the scope mounts I have tested, the best return to zero usually happens with, well, mounts like this. There are 40-25 screws in a long clamp, or with mounts like this with a couple of half-inch nuts. Use that and a torque wrench, and that generally will give you the best repeatability. There are two parts to repeatability. One part is you take it on and off the rail. and you see, and you want it to come back to 0 properly. Okay. The other part is how well does it survive if the rifle was accidentally dropped, travel, that kind of stuff. Right. And what I seem to be seeing is that vast majority of QD mounts have something spring-loaded in there. Okay. I'm testing one right now that actually looks pretty good, Burris XTR single-piece mount. That has two beefy leaf springs, but every time you have some sort of a QD lever mount, there is something spring-loaded in there somehow. And what happens is that when you have lateral shock on a scope mount, what you end up with frequently is a shift in 0 that's not due to the scope. It's often attributed to the scope, but due to the fact that you just bumped it from the side, acting against the spring, and it didn't quite return exactly where it should be. It's usually not a big shift, but it is a measurable shift. In a conventional mount using a regular clamp, and if using a torque wrench, there's nothing spring-loaded in there, and these seem to survive the rigors of travel and being dropped and all that better than QD mounts do. So in my personal use, I only use QD mounts where I really need to remove them, or on stuff like red dots holographics if I don't have, if it's not basically a precision weapon, right? Also, with a lot of red dots and holographics, I don't really have an option. They come with a mount, and a significant number of them do have QD levers. Here's an example. Here's a Gen 1 Vortex UH1, and it has a fairly decent QD mount. It is, I don't know whose design this is. I see this type of lever and a bunch of different stuff. This being one of them, and it's says patented. I'm not entirely sure who owns the patent. Okay. Right. Let's see, what other contentious topics do we have here? So I don't really promote odd mount. I use odd mount, and I happen to have a few of them that I use all the time, so I have them on hand. They're kind of hard to get these days. I don't make any money on talking about the odd mount, and I don't have a discount code. I've known the guy, John Odland, who is the proprietor of Odd Mount for quite a long time. He's a really good mechanical engineer. So when I recommend an odd mount to someone, if they're lucky enough to get their hands on them, I don't think I've ever seen anybody come back to me and say that I've steered them wrong. They're extremely stiff, they're extremely well made, and John did really extensive stress analysis on his design before he went to market. One of the reasons I talk about odd mount a lot is that it's safe for me to talk about odd mount. I'm very confident of his expertise. I'm not a mechanical guy. John is, and he's a good engineer. That's basically it. Okay. All right. Where are we? Horizontal versus vertical versus diagonal split rings. I prepared a bunch of mounts to show you. They are in one of the boxes here. You don't see the rest of my office. It's covered with cardboard boxes and stuff like that. On the sniper side, we had a long thread talking about vertical mounts being not terribly suitable for precision scopes. That is both true and not true. So inherently, if properly designed, it does not make any difference if the mount, if the rings are split horizontally or vertically or diagonal. Diagonal, I think it's on the spur, whatever is the right pronunciation. Maybe there are others. Maybe there are others. Doesn't matter. Excuse me. If everything is designed correctly, it should not make any difference. But in practical terms, most vertically split rings are not well designed for precision scope applications. Probably the best example would be the American Defense Manufacturing mount. I've actually used them quite a bit, and they're generally good mounts. They're generally fairly repeatable for QD mounts and all that sort of stuff. But the way most vertically split rings, are designed is you tighten them on one side and then you start tightening on another side, and they are designed so that the ring halves flex a little bit around the scope tube. Well, if the rings are flexing, so is the scope tube. The purpose of a scope mount, definitely for precision, but I think it also applies for other application, is to hold the scope in place without deforming it unnecessarily, because there are all sorts of moving things and sensitive components inside that you do not want them to be disturbed. They need to be able to move as the designer intended. And if you've just deformed the scope tube, you have interfered with the inner workings of a rifle scope. Okay? What that means in practical terms is that, yes, you can design a vertically split mount that works just fine. But if it is designed around ring halves being bending and flexing, you should generally stay away from it. Another good example is the Aero Precision mount that I'm not really crazy about. I have several of them, and I was curious, so I tried in a bunch of different scopes. I would absolutely not use it on any scope where you plan to be doing a lot of dialing. The only scope I've tried that absolutely does not care what mount it's in is the SWFA 329x42. So I have one of those, I think I do, in a Aero Precision mount. In a low power variable where you are going to set and forget and not twist turrets, most do better with these kind of vertically split mounts. However, not all. I've run into some that really didn't like it. But for example, Burris RT6 was totally fine in vertically split mounts, and I've tried different ring placements and stuff like that. Delta Hornet, which I think is a related design, and several others, and they all survived it just fine. The catch is that unless you are planning to do careful experimentation, given a choice, I would stay away from most vertically split rings mounts for the time being, because you simply don't know whether it's going to give you trouble or not. If you are naturally inquisitive and want to spend some time on it, by all means, go and do it, and you can figure out if they work with your scope of choice. And there's a really good chance that will work just fine. They've been making these for a long time, and hunters have been using them, and scopes stayed 0 and all that sort of stuff. We've really found a lot of this stuff in the precision world. And then after a little bit of digging, it turned out that a lot of problems that scopes were blamed for were really primarily the fault. Were really primarily the fault of the scope of vertically split scope mount, not the rifle scope itself. The same business for diagonal. It doesn't really matter in which direction you split, as long as the mount is well designed. What is well designed? Well, the front and rear rings have to be concentric. They have to be machined to spec, or within some certainly reasonably tight tolerance, and the ring halves have to be very stiff. That is something that doesn't get a lot of mileage, but it is important. And Jared, just for you, I'm going to mention the odd mount one more time. When I tighten these, and I've seen John's analysis, right? So why I can talk about it. When I tighten these from loose to tight to the right torque settings, is a quarter turn of the screws, something. It's very, very quick. What that tells me is that I'm not bending anything. I'm not bending ring halves. I'm not deforming the scope tube. If you got them kind of snug, and after that to get to your desired 15 inch-pounds, whatever torque setting, you have to turn the screws a fair bit. There are two options. One, you have screws with extremely fine pitch, which are generally not used in scope mounts all that much. Or, as you are tightening, things are flexing. Flexing when mounting a scope is not a good thing. Okay. And you do not know if it's giving you problems or not. You do not know if it's a short-term problem. You do not know if it's a long-term problem. You do know you don't want to be dealing with it. So the scope mount has to be set up in such a way that from loose to tight has to be as little of the rotation of the screws as humanly possible. That makes a significant difference. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. And once again, so all this business is most critical for precision-oriented scopes. If it's a set and forget stuff, you have a lot more. You have a lot more leeway. But if you're going to be twisting the turrets a lot, be really, really careful with how you mount this thing. Since we're talking about torque and screws, I'm gonna plaster on the screen an image of two different types of screws. They're not the exact type that is frequently used with rifle scopes. So there we go. Okay. Okay, here we go. So most screws used to attach ring caps are basically some sort of a socket head or related, I don't remember the term, I'm not a machinist, or related type screws. The thing that is important here is that you see my mouse. Notice that the bottom portion of the caps, that's what engages the ring half, is flat. Okay. Here is why that's important. Most manufacturers claim that the entire mount, upper ring half and lower ring half and all that, is made from one billet piece of aluminum, just machined all the way through, all the holes drilled all at the same time. So if everything is perfectly concentric, you're fine. I'm not necessarily going to rely on that very much, and I've mixed ring halves in the past and all that sort of stuff. Because there's clamping around a scope tube, there is a little bit of a self-centering effect for the top halves, right? So even if the holes that the screws go through are not perfectly aligned and there's just a little bit of slop, because the bottom of the screw head is flat, it is allowing the ring halves to self-center, in a manner of speaking, and still clamp without putting any significant stress on the on the scope tube. There are a few mounts out there that use conical screws. So this is not the exact screw they use, but this is a good illustration, right? Notice that with this kind of a conical stuff, the bottom of the screw head is a cone. It clamps on stuff very consistently. Cones are a good thing for a lot of different things, and it lines things up nicely and all that. However, if the holes through the screw halves are not perfectly bottom and top ring halves, are not perfectly matched, as you're tightening a screw with a conical head, what will happen is that you will misalign the top and bottom half of the rings, right? So as the screws tighten this thing, the ring halves can move laterally with respect to each other. And I've seen that bind parallax and make a magnification adjustment very stiff on a few scopes. And also because it not only deforms the tube, but it also cuts down on the engagement surfaces on the scope tube. And I've seen scopes slide, although they're torqued correctly. So you've just screwed up your adjustments and parallax and deformed the tube, and it's still not holding it very tight, right? So that is kind of a problem. Which mounts use this? I did not do an exhaustive study of which mounts use screws of this type. I stumbled on this completely by accident because not this exact type, but conical head screws I use, tapered conical, whatever you want to call it, are used by spur mounts, right? So I'm sort of on the record. I don't like those mounts very much. I think they are designed in a very attractive way. They clearly have done extremely well. They are expensive and they sell a lot of them. But I kept on seeing it from a lot of people saying things like, well, of all the expensive mounts, the only time I've had a scope slip in the rings was a spur mount. And then there was something binding. Then there was this. Then there was that. And I started looking into this and I realized that the screws they use are soft for some reason. They strip easily. And they have this kind of a conical head where if you have any sort of a tolerance stack up happening, these type of screws will exacerbate it. If everything is perfectly aligned, they will totally fine. If you are close to perfect, if the tolerances are good, these screws work perfectly fine. If the stars align just wrong, and you have some sort of a tolerance stack up happening between the ring halves and the scope tube, this will make it worse. Okay. Let me stop sharing that. Okay, and get to a couple of other things. Let's see. Where was I? Yeah, so something that should be covered in a little bit more detail, I suppose. One of the if you want to start a fight over something trivial, or not so much trivial, just some sort of minutia, go on some sort of a rifle scope optics forum and ask whether the front ring of the scope should be close to the turrets or should be close to the objective bell, and you will have a fight in your hands. Generally, the people who say that from a standpoint of stability and shock absorption and all that, you want the front ring as far forward as possible. That's true. But then a bunch of people will tell you, oh, but if you put it there, you will bind the parallax. That also can be true. And they say, okay, the scope, the front ring should be close to the turrets because there it cannot bind the parallax. They're all wrong, in a manner of speaking. You should have the rings that are properly aligned and properly torqued, and then they're not going to bind anything. Where the front ring is positioned should not matter too much. And I'm going to give you an example of two different rifle scopes. Both of them have side focus parallax adjustment. And that side focus parallax adjustment is the actual lenses that move and completely different parts of the scope tube. So unless you've taken it apart, you have no idea where those lenses are that you're trying to, that you should not be binding, right? So the first one that I'm going to show you is there we go, is a drawing that I marked up that wonderful people from Tangent Theta so nicely provided for me. This is how the internal construction of part of the internal construction of a Tangent Theta rifle scope works. Okay, so this is the way this cross section is done. If this is a scope, this is a horizontal cut through the middle, and you're looking through below at the cross section of a side focus turret. I'm talking about tangent theta. I should probably have the actual scope here, but it's somewhere. Okay, so the lens group that moves front and back slightly and changes the parallax and image focus is right here. It is actually not inside the 30 or 34 millimeter tube. Okay, it is actually right at the end of this tapered objective bell of a tangent theta scope. There are some advantages and disadvantages to this, but this is one of the reasons tangent theta has certain optical advantages. They have a rather sophisticated focus group, and it's fairly far forward. The way it is linked to the parallax turret, right? There is a metal aluminum tube that's inside the main tube. This is the focus cell. The lenses that you're trying to, that are moving, are at the very front of this parallax cell, right? There is a tube that they're in. The tail end of the tube close to the turret has a little lever that comes out, and there is a pin, okay, that is engaged by the parallax turret, and as you rotate the parallax turret, the spin is moved back or front, okay? And the lenses in the parallax cell and the focus cell move back or front and adjust the image focus and parallax, okay? So depending on how the tolerances stack up, you can bind this kind of a parallax cell anywhere in the tube if you've got stuff misaligned, or if you have if you are squeezing it with too much torque. I know that Tangent at some point had to change very slightly their tolerancing on how much space they have between the main tube and the tubes of the outer surface of the parallax cell, because people were just over tightening the front rings and binding it too much. So originally they started out a little bit too precise, and they had to loosen it very slightly. An actual question is that, well, why not leave a lot of space there? For several reasons. The biggest and obvious reason is that if you leave a lot of space, you always run the risk of something tilting, which will wreak havoc on the image and parallax and all sorts of other stuff. And also you have to be really careful with something called a reticle hop under recoil. When the gun is fired, you don't want these lenses to be moving up, down, left, right, that kind of stuff. So the tolerances there are quite tight. Okay. Let's see. I think I had another image that was worthwhile. Where is it? I opened a bunch of images here in preparation for this, and I'm just trying to make sure I find the right one. Okay, this is just a bigger picture of this same basic thing. I'll show you that briefly, and then I'll show you another scope design. Okay, right. So just something that will look a little bit bigger. so you can see better, right? This, where my mouse is moving, yeah, you see my mouse. These are the lenses that move front and back. This thing inside here, inside the main tube, is called, and my light just died again, hold on. Everything's crapping out on me. All right. Where was I? Yeah. So there is this internal cylinder that's called a focus parallax cell, whatever you want to call it. There's a little lever that's coming out, and there's a pin attached to it, right? And this pin is being pulled front to back. So that's tangent theta. Here is a, I'm going to close tangent theta because I have way too many images open here, and I'm going to show you how Vortex Razor AMG 6 to 24 by 50 is built inside, and that will hopefully demonstrate why we should not be making too many. There we go. We should not be making too many assumptions about this kind of stuff. No, that's not what I was looking for. Too many images, sorry guys. Yeah, so I've used CZ vertically split rings. They are the same style as the original Warn rings, and I would not use that in the precision scope. My standard recommendation, if you're going to be doing a lot of dialing, I would not experiment with this. These rings are designed so that they deform as you tighten, they squeeze the scope, and you have no idea if it's squeezing something important or not, and if the scope can take it, or anything like that. I probably would not experiment with it. It doesn't mean it's not going to work. It clearly works for plenty of people, but it doesn't work for some, and you never quite know if this is it or not. If you want to save yourself some headache, go the other way. Okay. All right. Let me make this a little bit bigger, and here is a Vortex Razor AMG sitting on the desk of a very nice gentleman at Vortex who sent me this picture. Why he has girlish purple scissors on his desk, I decided not to ask, just in case. None of my business what he does in his spare time. So what we're looking at, it's a partially disassembled Razor AMG. The side focus turret has been taken off. This is the focus or parallax cell, whatever you want to call it, that normally sits right inside the tube here. This little pin, that's what moves it front and back, that sticks out of this slightly oblong hole in the scope tube. And this is a side focus turret that has this sort of a kind of a elliptical opening. As you rotate the turret, this is what makes the pin and the focus cell move left, right, and sideways. Let me show you a close-up of this whole business. Okay. Let's see if this works. It's going to make it bigger. Yes. Okay. So in this picture, the focus cell is back inside the scope tube. This is a pin that's sticking out. The pin fits in this cut inside the parallax cell. And notice that here it's very close to the center axis of rotation. And as you rotate the turret, the pin gets further away from the center, and that's what makes the whole reticle cell move forward. Okay. I hope this is... So, Jared, I'll get to a question in a moment. I'll get... yeah, so this is kind of how it works, and I have another picture that shows the actual where the actual lens is, and that is important to me. Okay, this is what we want. Okay, let's zoom in on this a little bit. Here is why you should not make assumptions on where it's safe to clamp the tube or where it's not. The focus cell is outside the scope tube. Here's the pin coming out. Here's where the lenses are. They're right here. So if your intention is to squeeze this thing all the way in the back, well, you're squeezing right over the lenses. Something you were trying to avoid. Okay. The moral of the story: use a torque wrench, use high quality mounts, make sure everything is concentric, and don't fret too much where the rings exactly are. If you find that the front ring is binding something, you can experiment with moving it. But when you're just starting out, just first mounting the scope, mount it where it is convenient for you before you start jumping through hoops, because depending on which scope you're dealing with, you have no idea where it's safe to over tighten it, to the front or to the back, right by the objective bell or right by the turrets or anywhere else. You haven't the foggiest idea, and most of the time neither do I, right? Until I got these pictures from Tangent and from Vortex, I didn't really, I had some suspicions with Tangent because I've known some of the early designs. But with AMG, I had no idea where that reticle cell was. And I used an AMG scope for quite a long time. And I never gave me any problems. And I remember I had the ring right over the lenses, and I was totally fine, right? But I used a torque wrench and high-quality rings, and it did not give me any problems. Okay. All right. So before I get to Jared's question unrelated to scope mounts, so what's the conclusion from all of this? Most of my general purpose recommendations, so to speak, are guidelines on how not to make your life unnecessarily complicated. Don't go cheap. Use quality mounts. Stay away from mounts that are designed to deform as you tighten, right? Whether it's horizontal or vertical or whatever else. Stick with the Picatinny and NATO type mounts. There is a huge variety. You will find something that fits for you, that fits your mount quite nicely. If you are sticking with that, go with the NATO interface if you can. It's generally less likely to give you trouble. Once again, with all of this, if everything is perfectly in spec, you're not going to have issues. If things are out of spec and you have a tolerance stack up of some sort, to minimize the number of issues in those cases, you want to go with NATO interface, quality rails, quality rings. Oh, so one last thing that has been asked a few times that I don't talk about too much. There are several rings out there that have hinges. ARC rings, American Rifle Company. There is a company in Pennsylvania has really beautiful mounts. They also have like a pin and a hinge. The rings open like this, and all that sort of stuff. They are innovative, and they look good, and they attract attention. They use few screws, so theoretically, if you mount scopes on and off, in and out all the time, that seems like a good idea. From a standpoint of engagement, to me, it's a tolerance stack up waiting to happen. The hinges have to be a little bit loose, right? That means that the way you are engaging the scope tube cannot be symmetrical by definition. So something somewhere is not working quite right. Now, a bunch of people use them and it clearly works fine. Do I use them? No, I don't. For the same basic reason. I am trying to minimize the probability that I have to putz around with the scope mount, right? I have limited time. I have a lot of things to do. I want to mount my scope and go shooting. I do not want to troubleshoot my scope mount or the scope if it damages it, right? So all of the different rings that have a little hinge and a pin through them, I know my friend Bill loves ARC rings because they're so easy to use and they clearly work well for him. I'm not touching one. I don't think it's a good idea. From an engineering standpoint, I think it's a solution looking for a problem, basically. Okay, I use a ton of different mounts, and I generally follow my own guidelines, and I very, very seldom have any real issues. Please point out in the comments if there's anything else you want me to cover, if you guys think this is sufficient, or if you want me to do a follow-up video and walk you through the process. I will be happy to. Okay. All right. Jared had a question on reloading. So I've been actively trying to not reload because I don't have time. But I used to, and there is a really good chance that I will have to start again because this whole ammo shortage thing is beginning to annoy me. I have had a lot of different single stage presses and others. Generally, volume calibers I try to buy. I have a Hornady progressive press that I've reloaded quite a lot of 45, 38 special, 57 mag, 300 blackout, and 56 ammo on it with reasonable success. But given a choice, I'd prefer not to do it. Since I moved to New Mexico a year and a half ago, I never set it up again. I have been able to purchase enough ammo. Ammo was cheap. Now that everything is going to hell in a handbasket, and if Biden gets into the White House, it's not going to get better. It's not going to get better for 4 years or so. I'm probably going to set it up again. I'm definitely going to set up my turret press. I have a Redding T7 turret press to reload some precision stuff. I've used it on 308, 280 Remington. Probably need to set up to reload for 300 WSM and stuff like that. What else have I reloaded on it? I've reloaded 458 SOCOM, 762 by 54. I've reloaded a lot of different calibers. I found that I enjoyed doing this, but unfortunately, it takes a lot of time, and I don't have a lot of time. I have been able to purchase a lot of different ammo, so I will effectively look carefully in some precision stuff. I'm going to hand load. The rest of it I'm going to try to purchase for as much as I can. For example, I have a good amount of 308 I use, so I probably don't need to reload that for a while, although my primary precision gun right now is 308. Yeah. Okay, Jared, you are a trove of questions. All right, I'm glad you got the Delta. It's like that scope right here. It's sort of my reference standard that I use for side-by-side with a lot of other designs. Look, it's... I don't recommend CZ integral rings. They work fine, but I wouldn't recommend it for a scope that you will use. You will use for precision. For Hawa, I'm not sure what the right pronunciation is. Or for CZ, get some sort of picatinny rail. I do not remember off the top of my head which one works best, but most of them will work fine. For Hawa, get some sort of a picatinny base. Of the moderately inexpensive ones, I've had good luck with the EGW. They have been quite good. Generally, my almost default recommendation for a lot of things is Badger. I've never had any problems with Badger equipment. And then depending on the height you want, put on normal NATO spec rings. Badger is good. Sequence is good. Lately, I have been using a lot of Burris XTR signature rings. These are fairly trim rifles, so they might look a little bit funny, but they're kind of interesting. So the signature rings have these plastic inserts. Do I have a set here? I don't have a set here. Well, so the odd mount has these polymer inserts, and so does Burris. And they give you a couple of different sets. So if you're planning to extend the range, you can use different front and rear inserts to adjust the initial slope of the scope. The additional advantage of using these polymer or plastic, whatever they are, inserts, is that as you tighten the scope rings, you have aluminum rings and you have aluminum scope tube. And between them, there is some sort of fairly hard plastic that's still softer than aluminum. Under normal torque settings, I've never had any scope slip or get marked using Burris signature rings with those signature inserts. So for standalone rings, I've been using a lot of those. They're not compact or light, so if you are building sort of lightweight thing, might be something else. But with this scope, you probably don't care about weight too much. So Burris XTR signature rings would probably be close to the top of my list. Or if everything lines up well, just go all Badger, and that's pretty safe. Okay. All right, let me see. I'm going through my mental notes to see if there's anything else about scope mounts that I have neglected to cover. Oh, ring gap. That's actually important. Sorry, guys, I forgot. So when you remember, I talked about tolerance stack up. Well, you can induce a tolerance stack up, right? The way the rings are cut, there will be a small gap between upper and lower halves of the rings on two sides. And you have to make sure it is as even as you can. It's difficult to measure, so you kind of have to eyeball it, okay? And you cannot start, you should not, you can, you shouldn't. You should not start tightening anything with the torque range until you've lined up the scope reticle and until the gap between the rings is even. Because if it is not even, as you tighten the rings, you will be inducing lateral stress. Basically, worst case, right, you have a gap larger on the right of the rear rings, let's say, and the left of the front ring. Then as you tighten them, the scope tube is basically doing this. Okay, you are deforming it because of the self-centering effects of the ring halves. It's going to be pushed left on one side and right on the other side. And because there is some non-negligible engagement surface, you will be deforming and bending the scope tube. Okay. And anything else in my notes? No, I think that is largely it. Yeah. So first, so as I said before, don't overcomplicate your life. Get quality base, get quality rings. If you have an opportunity to go with a single piece ring, do so. Single piece mount, excuse me, do so. It's usually a good idea. There's less chance of the misaligned, not straight base misaligning the front and rear rings. And unless you like troubleshooting scope mounts, don't get too creative with this stuff. It's really not worth your time, not worth my time. Okay. All right. I've been talking for about an hour. I appreciate all of you guys who chimed in. Please subscribe, or if you want to support the channel, please join. There is a blue button underneath the screen. That's what helps me keep the channel going. I really appreciate your time, and unless there are any other questions from members, and it looks like there aren't any, I am gonna bow out, turn off the light, and go to sleep. My voice is kind of going anyway. I'm gonna try to do another. I'm gonna try to do another live cast next week. If you guys have a preference on the topic, I can adjust. My original plan was to talk a little bit about AKs. I just took delivery of a new AK-74 from Palmetto State Armory, so I'm gonna try to sneak out to the range and shoot it, but it might be a little bit difficult. New Mexico has entered another shutdown, and at least one of the ranges I'm a member of is definitely closed. I need to see if the other one is open, or if, well, technically I have the key. I'm not sure how they can prevent me from going. Anyhow, I need to go shoot my AK-74 and figure out the optics for it. I have a couple of AK-47s, so I'm pretty confident how I want to do optics for that. AK-74 is a different ballgame. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Good night.